So, web app basics. Web applications are designed, they communicate over the HTTP protocol, and it occurs in these request-response communication pairs. And so what that looks like is, on a web browser, you type in an address, you ask the server what's at that address, and it gives you a page, and that's all there is to it. And that just happens over and over. And that's stateless. So a server doesn't really know, if you ask it 3 questions in a row, it doesn't really know that you're the same person. It doesn't have any information from the first request when you're in the third request. And that looks like this. So you're the client, you get the first page, gives you page 1, and then you say, I want the next page. And it's like, I have no idea who you are, I don't know where you were, because it's stateless. This event pair is totally independent from the other event pair. Before I go on, you might think like, oh, we can just get around this by doing, I don't know, like tracking IP addresses or something. Like that doesn't work. IP addresses are relatively fluid, and also network address translation. Okay, so we can introduce something called a token to track what's called a session, because we want the same user to be tracked across multiple requests, so we can do interesting stuff in our web application. So here, the server can generate an ID and say ID 1 or ID 12 is on page 1, and then give the client back the ID. Then the client, in the next request, will say, I'm ID 12, give me the next page. The server knows that ID 12 was on page 1, is now on page 2, and gives back page 2. So through this ID mechanism, where the server stores an ID and the client presents that ID with every request, you can create a session. And so what's a session? It's linking together these request-response pairs. And it's to associate communication with a specific client. And so this can happen anonymous or authenticated. In the anonymous case, if you're just like a random unlogged in user of a website, you might set like a language preference without logging in or something like that. And the server wants to track that so that if you request French one time, it doesn't give you English the second time. You don't have to redo it for every page. So it's mostly useful with authentication, though. And when people talk about session management, they really mean with authentication. So let's say that you have a site, and every action that user does, they have like changing account details or changing payment information, making a purchase. All 3 of these different activities need, you need to know the person is logged in, that they are who they say they are, they have rights to spend money from that credit card, etc. So a naive approach is just everything that you do, you have to provide your username and password. And you can imagine this on Amazon if like every single page in that like 5-page chain of putting stuff in your cart, purchasing it, editing the information, and confirming it, if you had to put in your password every time, that'd be awful. So what you can do instead is create a token, just like we did before, but associate it with that specific user and that specific logged in instance. So what that looks like is user Alice with the password pass, not a good password, talks to the server. The server says, okay, token 12 is Alice's account, and then sends back, okay, client, you have token 12. This identifies you as Alex, or as Alice. Then Alice, because she's the admin, can say delete the database, but she doesn't have to represent her authentication credentials. She just has to present the token number 12, and then the server knows who she is and what rights she has. And there's a lot of difficulties in getting this kind of scheme right, like where the token comes from and how you associate it with that user and the session, and making sure the session doesn't get leaked. And there's different forms of disclosure, fixation, and prediction, and I'll talk about those. But the important point is that if you have a token, that's a lot like having someone's password, because how do you establish your identity with the server? In the first place, you give your username and password. But after that, there's also this token that has the same power, because all you have to do is present the token, and the token gives you all the same rights you would get if you presented a username and password. So it's really important not to leak this information. Otherwise, some people can log into your users' accounts who aren't them. And we'll look at some fun examples of that. So the real title slide. So basics first. When you give the token to the user, you have to give them some name to associate with it. So they have a little key value pair. I recommend ID, and this is what the web standard security practices also recommend. There's a couple examples here of like PHP sesh ID or J sesh ID, which is associated with J2EE. You can link information through this name. So like if you see this, then you know you're dealing with a PHP web application. and then you can do all your standard PHP attacks on it. Minor point, but just use ID. Simple, it works. Everyone uses ID. All right, more importantly, where does this key come from, and what are some properties that it needs to have, this token? So it needs to be long, 128 bits, or preferably 256 bits. And if you think about it, it's kind of like a password. You know, if your password is just like ABCD, it doesn't take very much guessing for somebody to crack that password. And the exact same thing is true here. Because you can imagine a user just sitting there being like, okay, I'm ID1, I'm ID2, I'm ID3. And as soon as that is a real ID that's actually stored on the server, they become that user. So it needs to be really long and random. It needs to be from a good pseudo-random number generator because, because you want it to be unpredictable. Because if I can predict the next token that a server is going to give out, I can just make my token that, and then I've stolen somebody's account. And again, follows the rules of passwords. So, you know, if I could predict what Andrew is going to make his password, I don't have to guess all of the possible passwords that exist. I just have to guess the things that Andrew is likely to create. So long, random. And I really do mean random. A lot of people like to do cute stuff deriving a token from user information. So like hashing their username, which is awful because then it's totally predictable. I just, as an attacker, also have to hash the same username, which is public information, and then I'm that user whenever they're logged in. That would be like just sending the password in the open. Don't do that. But you know, maybe there's like a secret detail with the user's account. You know, you like hash their password, then you're revealing the hash of their password, which can leak the password, and that's bad. So just simple stuff. Just generate a long random string, put it in a database, and then refer to it. And I'll talk about that more in a second. But here's another super important point. Nothing that we're going to talk about works if you're not using SSL or some kind of encryption between the client and the server. Because, you know, think about signing in on an unencrypted channel. You send your password and username in the clear. Anyone who's listening on that channel now has your username and password, and now they can become you. The exact same thing applies here. If you send the token in the clear, somebody else just looks at the token, sets their token to be that token, and now they're you. Everything has to be done. Oh, and I have a nice slide of that. So normal, you know, get a page, client has the token 12, there's an eavesdropper, then they just set their token, and now the server thinks, okay, you're Alice, I'll delete the database, even though the eavesdropper isn't Alice. And so this happened in the real world with Facebook and Twitter and a couple other big sites that just, they would use secure web pages for signing in, but as soon as you signed in, they would just send the tokens in the clear. And so somebody was really unhappy with this and developed an extension called Firesheep. And so that would just monitor network traffic in the Starbucks you're sitting in or wherever, and would pick up all of these session tokens, allow you to really easily replace your token, and then you just assume somebody's identity. And I have a screenshot from this panel is what the extension adds, and each one of these rows is just somebody else who's browsing the same location and their tokens. And all you had to do to have access to somebody else's Facebook account is click on that picture on the sidebar, and then it just reloaded the Facebook page as somebody else's account. So you have to use SSL or nothing's gonna work ever. And eventually, since this was so easy, Facebook and Twitter and the other big sites finally gave in and implemented SSL on their web stacks. And I love these kinds of attacks, just as a side note, where you kind of force a site to do something right by making it really easy for people to mess with it. And it was effective. So what kind of information do you store with a token? Because right now we just have, on your server, you create a token, you put it in a database, and you send it to a user. So what kind of information do we want to associate with that number that you're putting in your database? Most importantly, the account. You know, so you want to say this token is for Alice's account. It would be bad to just have a big list of valid tokens, and then you just trust whatever user happens to have one of those tokens. So like I could sign in as Jared, and then say, you know, I'm Alice, here's a valid token. And the server be like, okay, that does look good, you're Alice. Don't do that. It should be, here's my token, and the server's like, okay, from that information, I have stored that you are indeed Jared, so you're Jared. But you can also store, or it's also good to store, in some cases, the login time or the IP address that's been associated with that user. Their role and access rights are also very important, which brings me to one of the golden rules. Keep it on the server. Keep the access rights and the role and the account name, everything associated with that token on the server. Don't trust the client to keep it for you because they'll lie and give themselves more access than they should. So yeah, keep it in the database. And your normal database, I don't know how many of you guys participated in the hackathon this last weekend, or if you had a database, but that whatever database you were using, great place to store the tokens. Bigger sites, Redis is a good option because tokens don't stay around forever. They're very temporal. They kind of work for half an hour, and then get deleted. So putting it in your main database might feel kind of weird. And so there's other databases out there that are kind of made for those very temporal objects that only really live in memory. Anyway, so shifting to the client, when the server says, here's your token, the client has to store that somewhere. And there's one write option and a lot of other options, which is kind of how secure session management works. Most of the dangers in implementing these systems is just you have a lot of options, and there's a lot of bad options, and one right option that isn't always obvious. But in this case, the correct option is cookies. Your other options are HTTP headers, or these two very bad examples, part of the URL, so you can see /ID/ at the end, so you could substitute in the user's token there, or as a get parameter, which is where you have the URL and then $ID equals. You see this a lot too. We'll talk about why these are really awful later, but every attack that I'm talking about is way worse if the ID is stored in the URL. So browser cookies, like I said, are the way to go. And what cookies are is it's like there's this nice interface that you can request a web browser store something on behalf of your site. And then there's rules that can govern when that user's web browser is allowed to give that token back and when it expires. But it's just a database in your client's browser that you can interact with as a website. And cookies allow a lot of control, which is why they're so great. So one example is, if I am writing this for Facebook or whatever, I can say, here's the sessions token. Don't give this to any site except Facebook, because if any site were allowed to read tokens, then one site could just be stealing users' information to a different site and then impersonating their accounts. Another good option, you can request that cookies only be transported over SSL, and that's one okay way to guarantee that tokens never get sent in the clear. Because again, if they're sent in the clear, somebody can steal them. This option, HTTP only, is also nice to have. It means that cookies can only be sent, or your cookie can only be sent over HTTP. It can't be accessed from JavaScript running on the page or any other kind of client-side mechanisms. And so this disallows cross-site scripting attacks, if you guys are familiar with those, from accessing cookies and leaking them. You can also tell the browser, delete this cookie in a month or an hour or however long, which isn't a bulletproof mechanism, but it is one good way to expire tokens, and we'll talk about why that's important later. And of course, importantly, not exposed in the URL. There's this really great page, the OWASP page. They keep track of the most common vulnerabilities, and they have a really good guide on how to get this right. And there's a lot of options with cookies specifically. So if you're implementing one of these systems, highly recommend that resource. Okay, I keep saying storing the ID or the token in the URL is bad. There's a lot of reasons. One of them is if your user copy and pastes, everyone copy and pastes URLs. And so if you copy and paste your token with it, then you've just given somebody access to your account. And it's the same thing with the token getting stored in your bookmarks, but slightly less bad. But that's still, putting a cookie or a token in a place that it's bound to get leaked. And like I said, it compounds bad with session fixation attacks, which are one of my favorite things. We'll talk about that in a second. But first, as always, don't trust the user. A session, from the server's point of view, if a user gives you a token, that's user input, and it shouldn't be trusted until you validate it. Because you can imagine something like this, where an ID has, drop tables in it. So if you put this token in your database incorrectly, then, you could delete the whole database or drop all the users. It would allow a SQL injection attack, which is another talk, but also a fun attack. And like I said earlier, cross-type scripting attacks can happen if this token contains JavaScript, if somebody's faking it and contains JavaScript. The way to get around this, don't trust your users. There's this thing called base64 encoding, and its output only contains lower and uppercase letters, the numbers 0 through 9, plus and slash. And you can't encode fucking anything with these characters. That's not valid JavaScript, it's not valid SQL. So if you constrain your tokens to look like this, then you'll be safe. And it's also really easy to validate. You just make sure that it only contains those characters. Oh, it also can't contain HTML, which is another really common encoding error. Okay, so there's another concept, permissiveness and strictness. And strict means only accept tokens that were created by you, the server. Permissive means you'll accept unknown tokens, which there's this great graphic for. The problem, so Alice is authenticating for the first time, and she has a token with her that is 11. And the error happens right here, where the server decides, okay, 11 is a great ID for you, I'm gonna keep that and associate it with your account, and then it gives it back. This is really bad, because what you can do, oh, and by the way, the correct way to do this is right here, the server said, no, I'm gonna generate my own token for you, and then give that to you. And so, think about you're using some forum that you wanna hack, you wanna get admin rights, and they have tokens done this way. They're permissive with what tokens they accept. You can craft a URL like example.com with an ID baked into the URL, and then send this to an admin and be like, hey, I'm having problems with this profile page. The admin clicks on this page, and when they log in, the server, like right here, says, oh, sure, 11's fine. I'll authenticate 11. So the admin, so 11 now means you're the admin of the site. But since you are the one who created this URL, you already know that 11 is a valid ID. So you just set your cookie also to 11, and now you're the admin of the site. So earlier I said that like guessing tokens allows you to gain access to a user account, or if you can predict the token, this is another way to predict a token. So this is called session fixation. If you can force the server to use a specific token, then it's leaked that information because you already know what the token is. Does that make sense to everybody? This is a great kind of attack. And again, this would be way harder if you didn't keep the tokens in the URL. So don't keep tokens in the URL. All right, so another topic, or another thing that you should do is expire tokens. Facebook famously doesn't really do this. I think I had to re-log into Facebook after like 3 months of using it or something, and it was just because it was updated. Like, you log into Facebook and that shit's valid forever. What?
I turned on my desktop for the first time since 2012 and I was still valid.
Wow, exactly. Don't do that. So the danger here is that having a token isn't quite as good as having somebody's password, because their password is valid forever and a token isn't necessarily. But if you're like Facebook and you never expire tokens, then a token is basically as good as a password. So if somebody else, had Peter's password to Facebook, or sorry, his token to Facebook, even though they don't know the password, they could still be using Peter's Facebook forever because that token will never become invalid on its own. So set cookies to expire. OWASP recommends 15 to 30 minutes, but that's kind of annoying. So maybe more like an hour if that feels more reasonable. It depends. This is one of those parameters that depends on what kind of security you want. And obviously, shorter is more secure. And so earlier I mentioned that you can have cookies expire. Don't trust that mechanism. Like, that's a nice thing to have, but really you need to store the time that the user logged in with their token in your database on your servers and check it every time the user tries to use that token. Because again, if it's not on your servers, then it's data that a client could tamper with. Other reasons to change or to invalidate or expire tokens is when privilege level changes. So this could be like moving up from, well, one really good example of this is Amazon. Amazon, you're like basically always on your account, but every time you try to do something important, they make you re-authenticate. So it's kind of like they lose trust in your token pretty quickly, even though they'll still be willing to associate it with you as a user. But every time, you try to check out or view your past orders or change your payment information, they say, hey, give me your account and password again, or your username and password again, so I can make sure that you are still you. That's a really good system. I encourage people to use things like that. So these are all pretty reasonable things I've been saying. These are things that all sites should do. But if you want like a super critical security app, there's some like fun things you can do with sessions to enhance the security properties. Like I said, very short expiration times, make people re-authenticate frequently for basically any important step. Another fun one is to track the IP address of the user each time they visit or each time they make a request, and if that changes, invalidate their token, which can also be really annoying. That's not as foolproof as it sounds, but it can still be a fun thing to do. One great system is every time a user makes a request, the server generates a new token and gives that to the user. And this way, it forces, if somebody else gets the token, then either the real user can invalidate the old token and get a new one, or the person who broke in can invalidate it and get a new one, but you can't have multiple people using the same account at the same time, which is kind of weird, but it's pretty cool. So you only accept the new token, but you still keep the old tokens around. And if a site gets, or if one of your pages gets accessed with the old token, then you just invalidate all the tokens associated with that user. So like I said, if you have a token gets stolen between a request A and B, then two people, or one person makes a new request, which invalidates the old token. And then when whoever stole the token makes a request, both people get kicked out, and then only the person with the password can get back in. And then liberally invalidate the session when anything else suspicious happens is how to make session handling really secure. So any of these vulnerabilities that allow people to steal a session without necessarily having the username or password is called session hijacking, and it's the #2 most common web application vulnerability. And like I said, the OWASP guide is located at this link, and it's really, really good. And so if you're implementing one of these systems, I highly recommend you follow along with that guide. And the reason that most of these vulnerabilities exist is that there's a lot of ways to implement this system, and very few of them are secure, even though it's not always obvious why one choice or the other would be more secure. So you should really get this right, because it's not super difficult. It just requires making the correct choices. So you guys have any questions? Yeah, Nick.
What's the number one?
The number one is cross-site scripting, I believe, which is basically just, not sanitizing user input. Yeah.
So how does Facebook get away with keeping their tokens so long?
Mainly, it's just not.
Somebody gets here.
Thank you for answering for me, Peter. It's basically not a high security application. Yeah. And it's like, and basically all the changes you can make to it, I mean, it's a privacy violation if somebody steals your account, but as soon as somebody posts something, you, the legitimate user, would also be able to see that. And Facebook fucks up all the time, and nobody cares because it's Facebook. They're just too ubiquitous to care. It's like the too big to fail thing. Other people, sessions, come on. It's just awesome. Yeah.
I know some sites like Facebook and Gmail will keep track of all your past sessions, and you can see like where your recent sessions are, and they'll have an option like sign me out of everywhere else.
Right.
I've noticed that even if you do like sign out from those devices, it'll still say you're logged in. Is it a common practice to invalidate your token when you click log out?
Yes, sorry, that's something I probably should put in. When somebody does an active log out, so they don't just log out after a certain amount of time, but they click the log out button, you should go to your database and wipe out that token so that when they click log out, they're for sure logged out. And one important place to do this in is like you can think of a public workstation at like a library or something. If you click log out, you should be able to rest assured that somebody can't just hit the back arrow, thus getting your token and have your account. So yeah, definitely expire the tokens when somebody clicks log out.
On that, like when you were talking about the making a new token each time on a request.
Yeah.
If, say, someone logged out, like, or just exited.
Right.
As that person got, like, so they both got it, but they didn't make a new request.
Right.
That other person would be able to be that person, right?
Right, so if they clicked log out, then the site should go to the database and expire the current token. But if they just exit out of their browser, the server has no idea that that happened. In which case, yes, somebody else, if they had if they had timed it just right where they got the right token, then they could continue browsing. And one good thing to do, I guess, is like you would track with that user the last time that they entered their password and username, and then expire any token for that account no matter what when that date gets too far away or when that time gets too far away. So if you did log out, somebody else who had successfully stolen your session only has it for 3 minutes or however long you make it. Cool. You guys should all go. Yeah.
So now that SSL usage is pretty widespread, what are kind of the most common ways that sessions are hijacked?
There's still tons of ways to leak them. There's a lot of ways you can mess up cookies. One common thing that websites do is use different servers to serve their CSS style sheets and images and those kind of static resources, and a separate one to serve other information. And so if you have a lot of subdomains, if you misconfigure it, then tokens might get sent over the wrong subdomain. So you can imagine if you don't set it up right, you make a request to resources.example.com. If a token gets included in that, that's probably not an encrypted connection because it's just an image being sent. So that'll be another one where the token is sent in the clear over the wire. Tons of ways to leak around that. Like I said, the session fixation attacks are pretty common. With people storing them in the URLs is another way to leak it. There's just lots of ways to leak that information. Also, there was this awesome lab we did in cryptographic engineering where the random number generator on the server was predictable. It was using just the standard Python random function, which, while it does create good numbers, is not cryptographically secure. So we're actually able to request a bunch of sessions, rebuild the state of the generator, and then predict the next tokens it would generate. So even though they weren't being leaked anywhere, we knew what the future tokens were. Yeah.
And then with kind of content delivery networks,
yeah,
pretty common nowadays. So then should you always implement with SSL on your CDNs or what's
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, you should have an encrypted link to your CDN, and your CDN should have an encrypted link to the user. So it should be encrypted the whole way. Yeah, anyone else? That'd be fun, though, to be a CDN and just steal session tokens. It's so illegal. Cool. All right, well, go implement secure sessions, guys. Don't mess this up.